Hello and welcome to CDBG Environmental Review Training for 2021. My name is Ed Bosch. I am a project manager here with Iowa Economic Development Authority. I'm also the acting environmental review officer. Ann Schmidt is our architectural historian, and she handles the Section 106 part of environmental review. She has posted her own individual training on that part of the environmental. So I have divided this training into 4 parts because it consists of about 187 slides. So obviously I didn't want anyone to have to sit through all of those at any one time. So the whole concept of the environmental review goes back to the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. It is the basis for protecting the environment, and it requires that environmental values be given appropriate consideration in decision making by federal agencies and in all of the projects that they fund. Also requires environmental information be made available to citizens and interested parties and other decision makers before those decisions are to the point where actions are being taken. HUD regulations implementing the National Environmental Protection Act can be found at 24 CFR Codified of Regulations, Part 58. That applies to states, Native American tribes, and local governments. And actually, as a local government, when you receive a grant from IEDA, you become what they call the RE, the responsible entity. The RE assumes responsibility for the environmental review, for the decisions made within that review, and for the actions of the project that apply to HUD under the NEPA and its related laws. So keep in mind that when you're talking environmental review, it is reviewing the project and not funds. It does not go with the CDBG funds or funds from any other source. It's the entire project. So when you receive clearance on that project, it is, again, the entire scope of the project, not just any particular funding source. Here's a list of some of the related laws and authorities. There are others, but we list some of those later in some other slides. However, we boil down the key components of all of these acts so that you don't have to read through all of them. But if you would like to Google them and do a little research on your own, that's fine. There they are. When you consider the impacts of the project, you need to look at a wide variety of items. Endangered species, wetlands, historic properties, air and water quality, toxic contamination, radon, explosive operation, noise, airport hazards. Those are all, of course, man-made type of situations that affect the environment, and of course flooding. And you make a determination, depending on your level of review, of adverse effect, no effect, or in some aspects, projects can of course be beneficial to the environment. Important to realize that prior to your release of funds, the recipient, the RE, may not commit HUD funds or any other funds, be they public or private, where the activity that those funds are sponsoring would have an adverse environmental impact or limit the choice of reasonable alternatives. Now, in HUD's language, choice limiting actions are things that could disqualify your entire project if you undertake them before release. So very important to keep that in mind. Those include bid letting, real property acquisition, leasing, disposition, demolition, rehab, repair, renovation, and so on. Any kind of construction item certainly is a choice limiting action. Anything that impacts the environment is maybe a good rule of thumb to keep in mind when looking at limiting actions. If you ever have a question on whether something is a limiting or choice limiting action or not, give us a call before you undertake it. The environmental review record, the ERR, is actually the written evidence of your review and the decisions you made and any actions that you take. Contains all of the evaluations, findings, decisions, documents, and notices. It's your only proof of compliance with federal environmental law, and it's also your defense against environmental challenges. And keep in mind that if you have someone, an individual or a party that wants to derail your project for whatever reason, an easy place to attack it is through the environmental review record. And if they find that that is flawed in any way, it will stop the entire project. So important to do this thoroughly and to document it properly. Review process. Well, you start with defining your project. Very important. Sometimes I think people overlook a full definition of the project and a full understanding. You determine your level of review, perform the review, publish your notice, depending on your level of finding, which we will get into here in a minute. You request your release of funds, and then we will issue a release of funds letter, or in the lowest level of review, it may take the form of an email and an approval through the Iowa grants process. When you're defining your project, you need to capture the maximum anticipated scope of the proposal. So, including maps, aerial photos, good narrative, descriptive narrative, budgets, and a project schedule is helpful in defining the project. And you must evaluate all related activities as a single project based either on geographical or functional basis. They are logical parts of a composite of contemplated actions. So this is HUD's theory of aggregation, and it means that any part of the project will be considered to be covered in the environmental. You cannot segment the project out. You cannot divide even logical steps, such as if you would have demolition, clearance, and new construction. You cannot treat demolition or the new construction separately. That's all part of the same environmental review. When you are defining the project, again, depending on your level of review, the higher up the ladder you go, the more important it is, but you should look at other alternatives, designs, sites, actions, timeframes. The vast majority of the time, there is really no practical alternative. However, you should still list those when it's called for and give it some thought and a logical response as to why it would not work or would not work better than what you are planning. Levels of review goes all the way from exempt to categorically excluded, not subject to the checklist 58.5, or excluded but subject to that compliance with that checklist, environmental assessment, and then at the ultimate level of review, the environmental impact statement. Environmental impact statements are very rare. Hope that you don't have to ever do one. I was involved in one in my time with the city. Took about 18 months to do and about 5 people working on it. They're very intense, very detailed. And if you think you're in a position where you might have to do an environmental impact statement or an EIS, check with me first and we'll make sure that that's your only alternative. So exempt activities are things that have no physical impact on the environment. Easy way to think of it. A lot of paperwork type of activities here. Administrative, planning, design, management, testing, purchase of tools, insurance, technical assistance, payment of principal of interest, or temporary assistance for disaster or imminent threats. And actually with COVID, you see a lot of exempt activities that are housing payments or rental vouchers for individuals that are having issues with COVID-related hardships. Categorical exclusions. They are actions that do not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect. So under that, there are two types: not subject to the related authorities, which again is a checklist that's spelled out in 58.35 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or subject to, which is a little higher level of review. And we'll explain that in the following slides here. So not subject to, they are, for example, an economic development activity not associated with construction or expansion of existing operations. For instance, just the purchase of equipment, purchase and then installation of the equipment, but no construction, no expansion, no renovation, rehab, and such, no physical work. Or in terms of housing, activities to assist home buyers to purchase existing dwelling units, including closing costs, down payment assistance, interest buy downs, or activities that result in the transfer of title. Now again, these are things that have no impact on the environment. Keep in mind though that upper story rehab is not in this category, and that is because it constitutes a change of use, and I'll explain that a little further here in this part of the presentation. So subject to continued acquisition, repair, improvement, reconstruction, or rehabilitation of public facilities and improvements when the facilities improvements are already in place and the change in size and capacity is less than 20%. And again, as I just said with upper story rehab, no change in land use. And upper story is considered a change in land use, and that will knock you out of this CE subject to category of review. So again, it has to be less than 20% change in size of capacity to fall into this level of review. If it's more than that, it's not categorically excluded subject to, it becomes an EA, an environmental assessment. If line size goes from 4 to 8 inches, that's considered 50% change. Okay. Facilities and services in place, we mean the footprint of the facility won't change. And when we talk about that, we're talking about a building. Now, we do have some flexibility in terms of like water and sewer treatment plants when there are expansions of certain types of facilities, but they are on the existing land that the city owns and has been previously disturbed. We usually do not consider that in itself to be a disqualifying factor in categorically excluded subject to, but if your expansion of facilities is more than 20%, then you will not be able to call it categorically excluded. So some other common examples of categorically excluded subject to: single family residential, as long as it's not over 4 units. And again, upper story does not qualify. And commercial, industrial, public, or institutional projects, again, below 20% and without a change in land use. So you cannot have an increase of size, density, cost, land use, or a building's footprint. Okay. Some requirements don't apply on a project-by-project basis. In fact, quite a few of them will not apply as you go through individual projects. Good examples of that would be Coastal Barrier Resources Act. That refers to not the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, as we commonly call that the east and west coast in the state of Iowa, but actually the Atlantic and the Pacific is what they're talking about there. So never going to apply to a project in Iowa. National Flood Insurance Program doesn't apply if you're not in a floodplain, and airport runway clear zones don't apply unless you're within a certain distance of an airport. So those are three examples, but again, as you go through individual projects, many of these factors will not apply. Some will, and it's the key is finding the ones that do and addressing those. For categorically excluded subject to projects, there is a separate form, and you can find that 25 CFR 58.6, and that is a checklist. For environmental assessment projects, it's actually incorporated into your documentation and not a separate form. Here's an example of 58.5 statutory checklist, and this is actually 50.4, which is a different checklist that you probably won't see, but it was used to illustrate that putting NA is not acceptable to HUD's environmental office. So you see there, they have taken NA and said that's not acceptable, not allowed, not appropriate. So even if you have factors that do not apply, let's take number 22 there, protection of wetlands. Let's say you're miles away from the nearest wetland. You still have to state that in the source documentation that your project's miles away from any wetland, won't be affecting it. And you have to provide a wetland map as documentation to show the project location in relation to that wetland so that we can clearly see that it is not in a wetland designated area. But remember, just saying NA is not going to get you the environmental clearance you're seeking. So support documentation, you can always, when I was doing environmentals, I did always go out to the field and make my own observations, see it for myself with my own eyes. That's very helpful. I would always encourage that. You can interview engineers, architects, city officials, whoever, to get information. And you certainly can use and upload printed materials, letters and emails, even phone logs, maps, aerials. Maps are great. I really like to see those included whenever you can. Reports and studies and analyses. Again, water and sewer projects. I see engineering reports, studies. Don't have to upload them, but if you think it's helpful in explaining your project, that's fine. If you want to excerpt certain parts of it and include that, that's also fine. It's 150 pages, but only 10 apply or to the environmental. Just upload the 10. Don't do the 150, because you know, I would rather not read 150 pages if I don't have to. And of course, photographs of any kind are helpful of the project site, particularly. All right, so the next level of review is environmental assessment, and that is when it's not exempt, it's not categorically excluded, subject to or not subject to, and it is not intense enough to meet the EIS environmental impact statement threshold. There is an environmental assessment format that you must follow. Statutory checklist, the 58.6 and the 58.5 is a statutory checklist actually. And then you have to do an assessment of impacts on a categorical basis, land, socioeconomic, and several others. So there are 3 forms for environmental assessment, basically. And most community facility and water and sewer projects fall into this category. And again, all housing sustainability grant upper story projects fall into this category. So you can request a copy of other federal, state, or local agencies' environmental assessment and use that to help you complete your assessment. But we must still independently review the analysis, prepare our own EA. We, meaning actually you in this case, the RE, and be responsible for the required environmental finding and complete the request for release of funds process. Okay, then HUD has some of their own special requirements about airports and runways, clear zones, noise, and explosive operations that you will address. And the REU and HUD, being us in this case, may only adopt another environmental assessment if a cooperating agency agreement exists. And you can see what that means at 58.52. It's rare that you would adopt or use some other environmental assessment, but it is possible. Okay, tiered reviews. So when you have a project that you are not sure of all of the specific sites, and individual owner-occupied housing rehab is the best example of this, where you don't know for sure what houses you'll be doing. You can go to a tier 2. Downtown revitalization projects also will fall under a tier 2 unless it's a single building application, because you're not sure until construction starts what buildings are all going to be in. So you do your broad review, the tier 1, address all the laws and authorities, and establish a plan for what you will do on the site specific, and put that into part of your tier 1 to explain what your tier 2 will be. You do publish a notice of intent to request release of funds, and you submit that request for release of funds to us. In tier 2, you go to the site specific review, like the house at 123 Main Street. And then you will do your tier 2 on that specific house, and you do each home individually. However, and that goes through Ann Schmid because it includes the 106. There is no public notice or request for release of funds required for that level of review unless something comes up that changes your original tier 1. And that would, again, be very rare that you find something that would be of a importance that it would affect your tier 1. So usually your tier 2s are just that, and they don't affect your tier 1. So again, here's an example. You would do your entire environmental review on the red outlined area, the entire project area on a large scale, and then the yellow dots would represent what you do your tier 2 on. So when would you need to update the ERR? Well, it's required when new activities are added or unexpected conditions arise or substantial changes are made to the nature or magnitude. So If the original finding is still valid despite new conditions or new activities, all you do is a memo to the file, send it to me, and I will put it with the rest of the documentation. However, if it's so significant that the finding is no longer valid or the project is significantly changed, then you've got to go back to the beginning and prepare a new review and do your local comment period and a new request for release of funds. Now, this is most commonly happens when I do my review of the ERR and find that perhaps the level is not correct. There have been occasions where there is a submittal for a categorical exclusion subject to, and I find that it should really be an environmental assessment. In those cases, unfortunately, you have to go back and redo your assessment and redo your public notice. So, two routes for request to release of funds and notices. If it is categorical exclusion, subject to, you do a notice of intent to request the release of funds. Okay, and if it's exempt and not subject to, you actually don't do a notice at all. So that's why that's not on there. If it's an environmental assessment level, you have a combined, what they call a combined notice. Notice of intent to request a release of funds, just as above here, but also a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. The FONSI is not required at the categorical exclusion subject to level, but is on the environmental assessment. So categorical exclusion projects subject to, that's CEST. So the RE mails and publishes or posts the notice of intent to request release of funds. You have a 7 or 10-day comment period. It's 7 if you publish in a newspaper. It's 10 if you're a very small community and you actually post your ordinances and such. The RE addresses any comments that may be received during that period. Then they sign the request for release of funds, submit that to upload it in Iowa Grants, and then also have to send a hard copy to our office, to me at the office. HUD still requires that for some reason. With that, we need proof of any mailings, and that would be to interested parties or individuals, which there's a slide coming up about that. Proof of the publication or certification of the posting. We then have a 15-day comment period, and then we'll issue our issue our release of funds letter. Then you can go ahead, once you get that release, and start the project in all aspects. So environmental assessment, a little bit different. Again, you have the combined notice of the FONSI, notice of intent to request release of funds, finding of no significant impact. In this case, you have 15-day local comment period, 18-day if you post. 30-day comment period only comes into play if you have a floodplain project, which we're going to talk about in segment 3 or 4 of this whole training, and you don't do a combined floodplain FONSI notice, then it would be 30 days. But I don't know why anyone would not combine them in case they couldn't help it. So the vast majority of time is going to be 15 days, and then for the very small communities, 18 days. The RE addresses any comments received during the comment period. Again, just like the previous slide, signs the form, submits to the state, proof of mailings, if there are any, publication and or posting. We then have our 15-day comment period. Again, we do our release of funds letter and you're good to go. All right, so timing. This is important because if you mess up on the timing, it disqualifies the whole thing, unfortunately. So you start your local comment period the day after publication. Do not count start counting the day it's in the paper, the day it's posted. You have to start the day after. If your last day, your comment period, 7 or 10 or 15 or 18 days, falls on a weekend or a holiday, you should extend it through the following business day. And you can extend it longer for any reason if you'd like, although I've never seen anybody want to extend their comment period beyond what they have to. So then the RE signs and submit the request to release the funds the day after, again, after the last day of the comment period. So you start counting the day after the publication or notice, let that run, and then the day after it's over, you can go ahead and sign and submit the request for release of funds. And here's a calendar example of what I was just talking about. Publication date here on the 1st. Comment period runs through the 8th. On the 9th, you do the request to release of funds. So you're not counting this date, you're counting from the 2nd. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then your comment period is over. And the day after, you do your request for release of funds. When it's 15 days, it carries out to the 16th and the 17th, with the same concept applies. All right, so here's the standard notice of intent to request release of funds. Now, this does not include the FONSI. This is just notice of intent to request release of funds. So use the HUD template for your notice. It's on our website. It contains the minimum content you need. You can add language, but don't subtract from it, because everything that you see in the template is required. Finding of no significant impact and intent to request release funds must be mailed to interested groups and individuals. Now, some individuals and groups will let you know they want to be notified, or you can, even if they don't, you can take it upon yourself if you know there's particular interest from someone, some group, some person in your community. You can go ahead and send it to them. And again, if there are any comments, you need to resolve those before you send the request for release of funds into us. And if there were any comments and resolve them, that should be part of your environmental review record. All right, so on posting, you should post notices within the neighborhood impacted if it is just a particular neighborhood. Most of the time, what we see are community-wide effects. However, you could have a targeted area that is the focus of the entire project. Okay. Publish notice in a newspaper of general circulation in the affected community. And then for documentation, copy of the newspaper publication and affidavit of publication. Posting, copy of the posted notice and signed statement of distribution. And then if you mail something, a statement again, probably from your mayor or city clerk, in both posting and mailing, certifying that it happened. Okay. Okay, there's the FONSI notice. You are asked to send, or required actually, to send a FONSI to individual and group known to be interested, again, known to be interested, or that even if they haven't told you they're interested, if you know they are, you should do this. Local news media, appropriate tribal, local, state, and federal agencies, appropriate ones that have an interest, and the regional EPA and the local HUD office, which is us. Now, EPA Region 7 only wishes to see what they call complex environmental assessments, or EIS level reviews. You may just call them and ask them if you have a project, if it's something of interest to them. I think I can't speak to this 100%, but I think most water and sewer projects are not going to be of interest to the EPA regional office. But again, you can check and see, or just send it to them. If they don't want it, they'll probably tell you, don't bother us with this again, this kind of project. Appropriate agencies depends on project, the complexity, any controversy, specific impacts, and so on. So again, the request for release of funds forms 7015.15. It can be found at the HUD Exchange, and it's also on our website. We also have packets that detail information that goes in each section. Form must be signed after the public comment period is ended and must be signed by the RE's chief executive officer, being the mayor of a city or a board chair of a county. Okay. So at our website, this is part of the information that we have there. I would certainly advise you to look at our website and both at the CDBG management guide and also in this particular section on environmental for a lot of the forms and a lot of information about the steps and how to fill things out. General instructions should be very helpful to you. Okay, so again, categorical excluded, not subject to packet is on our website. So is the categorical excluded packet that is subject to, and then the environmental assessment packet. Okay. So please consult the website for pretty detailed information on these different levels of review, and just follow along. If you have questions, don't understand something, I'm always available to ask questions or to answer questions that are asked. So you upload your environmental review record regardless of the level of review. There are slots available in Iowa grants to do that. And then again, you send the original of the 7015.15, the request for release of funds, to us. You upload it first, or you can upload it simultaneously when you with sending it, actually. And then it needs to be accompanied by a copy of the publication and affidavit of the publication, or in the case of notice, certification of that it was posted. Okay, so that is the end of segment 1. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next part.